welcome to the stage Christian, who's going to talk to us about some experiences from AbbVie.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm Christian. I joined AbbVie 5.5 years ago in my role as a solution architecture lead. And in solution architecture, we bundle data architecture and systems architecture. And before I jump into the presentation, my favorite movie is Despicable Me. I don't know if you have seen this. The reason is I was there with my children in the cinema and they were completely stunned. It was the first time they were in the cinema, and if you haven't seen it, it's really worthwhile watching it. All right, for the sake of time, I think I skipped the company slides, directly jump in. So we are embedded as a department in development sciences. Development sciences comes after discovery. So typically what we are doing is that we are turning molecule candidates, if you want to say it like this, into commercial products. And these candidates come from discovery. And you see there is a staircase here where basically it's a dotted line, so there's no real line, there's a gray zone in between, but discovery produces selective and potent candidates for druggable targets. Yeah, and then all the fun starts here, turning these basically into medicines, and you can see here all the different attributes that need to be taken care of during discovery. And as some of the speakers already mentioned before, we have, of course, data stored in silos, both in physical and in logical silos because they are not aligned. We have data of diverse nature, and in our hands, the variety problem, the variety is the biggest problem. It's not so much the velocity and volume. And then the typical pain points are tedious and error-prone data handling, and application of modern data visualization or AI tools is then, of course, a bit difficult. Okay. So you heard a lot today about IT driving implementation. So you see the systems architecture here is basically our smallest gear. So that is driven by data architecture, and that is driven by what we call scientific architecture. And scientific architecture is basically that we try to develop a deep understanding of specific use cases. And we go with specific use cases that we prioritize together with our business partners to avoid sort of a boil of the ocean approach to come up with too ambitious solutions. And then we assess the data requirements in the second gear, and from the current state analysis and the data requirements, we then develop together basically updates to the data and to the business processes before we go into the third phase, which is then the smallest gear here, which is driven by the others, which is basically creation of a comprehensive solution. And here, when we heard this also before, we want to avoid something like a problem-seek solution situation. And by this approach, we can deliver, we solve individual pain points, we deliver tangible outcome in a short time. And what is important to us is the scalability, and I will show this to you on the next slide, what I mean by this. So we had one of the use cases in the beginning was documentation of small molecule formulation composition data. And there we had to establish a bunch of tools and connections between the tools. So we needed an ELN template. We had to have a change process so that people who were used to document their formulation composition data in Excel basically were trained to use the ELN template instead. We had to create an ETL infrastructure to bring this data that we collected and structured in the ELN into a set of tables in our data warehouse. And the scalability comes then on the right-hand side. So horizontally, we scaled from the small molecule compositions to biomolecule compositions, so it's more analogy. And the vertical scaling is really pimping this approach. And we went from composition to recipe by incorporation of process data. Because the composition does not mean anything for a formulation, you have to know how the composition was generated. The second example, electronic request submission. I mean, when you're working in large pharmaceutical companies, you can imagine there's all kinds of ways how requesters give requests to the analytical people on paper, by email, with a Sharpie, or in German with the edding on a flask. And so we established an electronic request submission system to have a basically convenient request management for the people who enter the requests and for the people who basically work on the requests. The horizontal scaling was We included more and more analytical teams from analytical chemistry and also went beyond. So this is now the tool for requests. And the vertical scaling here was we went from simple requests to more complex studies. Because what is, for example, a stability study, that means you store your samples for a certain amount of time under certain conditions, and then basically you subject them to analysis. And so then we build a wrapper around our request system that sends out automatically then requests at the right point in time to the right people to pull the samples out of the fridge. And the last example that I have here is the genealogy. So, I mean, batch genealogy is an important topic. And we created, enabled a batch genealogy tree for pilot plant data. And we had to tap an external source because these data are stored in SAP. Everybody who has worked with SAP knows how much fun that is. And then we had to align the independent data models because, of course, SAP has its own, completely own data model that has nothing to do with what we have in mind. And then we created a graph data model basically to enable this specialized genealogy perspective on the data, because it's something that you cannot really solve with relational data models. And horizontal is ongoing now, so we apply this to all other kinds of batches in our data warehouse. And vertically, we want to use the graph technology basically for areas beyond just visualizing the things. I mean, you can think about calculation of effective compositions, and also many of the modern AI tools best work of graphs. So this is something we also want to put on top once this is established. Okay. So some words on our general architecture. So this is our zoo of data sources. So we have different ELNs, LIMS systems, SAP. We have custom developed input tools. We have instrument files and a bunch of more things. Then we have a layer of standardization in between. And in the second part of the presentation, I will talk a little bit more about this. We introduced something that is called data contracts. Probably different people understand different things under the term data contract. But for us, it's standardization of items. You will see this on the next slide. And we also worked in particular on the analytical results on a taxonomy to standardize the content. Then data goes into a data warehouse. It's a relational data model at this point in time. As I said, we don't have a volume problem or a velocity problem. We have a variety problem. And the relational data model was a good compromise to solve this problem for us. And on top of this, we have basically opportunities to serve the data in form of end-user tools. We have tools like Spotfire or bespoke applications. The genealogy graph is also something that we put a tool on top, and we have specific views and APIs for people who want to do some more sophisticated stuff with this kind of data. Okay, as I said, I would like to focus the second part, dedicate the second part to the standardization that we worked on. So basically, we divided the world into two pieces, what we make and how we characterize it, top level. In blue, you see here the things, what we make. So we have materials, batches, samples, and containers. We have components that apply to materials and batches. We have process steps, and you can probably extend this list with a few more. And on the other end, we have here tests and results in green. And in the middle, you have things that don't really fit into any of these categories. These are more transient things like our requests, because the request becomes irrelevant after the analytical result has been produced for a sample. And all these boxes basically is what we turned into data contracts. So these are basically the task is now for all the sources that are listed to identify comparable items. So what does SAP understand as a material? Does it match what, for example, our ELN understands as a material? Same with batches and so on. And the data contracts, basically, they are formal standards for most common metadata. You see here screenshots for batches and I think for results. And most common metadata, for example, contain who made it, when it was made, what was made, and basically the most important thing is an ID. And you see this little p here in every of these boxes. This supports parameters, and this comes on the next slide. Because one of our biggest challenges is control terminology for analytical results. You see we have here the case where we have different names for the same thing. American versus British spelling is a simple case. Stearate versus favorite, stearate with a capital R. Process versus process channel description, this is what it was called in the source. and then all different ways how time point can be spelled. But we also have the other problem that we have the same name for different things. So time point can be a timestamp or can be a duration. And the challenge that we now have is if we tell our business people, you have to call something, I don't know, in a different way than they used to call it before, then we risk something like this here, that the riot comes up. And our approach to basically minimize the riot risk, or the task is here. So we have to do something on standardization to ensure the data integrity through controlled terminology. At the same time, we have to minimize the changes on the currently used business terminology. And our approach is here, I mean, that's not rocket science. So we, as a data architects, we define parameters. So we call, for example, the thing clarity value, and not turbidity, clarity, opacity, or Trübung in German. And this is fully controlled terminology that we basically control. And the business can continue to use their own terminology, which they have always used. We use this as a display name. And the example that you see on the side is a turbidity measurement. Let's say we have 3 lab teams working independently in different areas. They all do turbidity measurement. One is used to call it clarity, next one is called it turbidity, next one is calling it opacity. Then it's our task basically to recognize that these things are actually meaning the same, map them to the same parameter, and then store the parameter side by side with the original name in the data warehouse. So through this we have basically synonyms, and we have a preferred synonym if you wish. Then this will allow us basically to collect large data sets based on the parameter ID, and also allow local data retrieval based on the terminology that people are used to. Okay, so then the next thing was, so we have now the control terminology, but in our hands it made sense to organize this terminology in a hierarchy, and then we're talking about a taxonomy. And so we have a 3-layered hierarchy here. So we have on top the scientific question, basically what do you want to know from your sample. The next layer is the experimental approach to the scientific question that we call test. And then the next layer below is the parameter, which is the answer to the scientific question. And I have here 2 very simple examples. Scientific question is physical appearance. We can measure the color, and we can have the clarity. And we can do this qualitatively by visual inspection. And then we get a parameter here. Or we can measure the color or the clarity. And then we get more or less a quantitative thing. This is a value. And again, a qualitative description. And the same is for clarity. We may also have a reference for clarity. And in this case, our clarity value is connected to another taxonomy, which is where the units are managed, because this is another problem. To make it unambiguous, we create then this ontological relationship. This approach also works for more complex things. Think about particle size distribution. So this is you can see this here. So imagine you have a cascade of sieves with decreasing pore size, and you put your sample on top of that sieve, of the first sieve, and then you shake it. Then basically these particles will be separated based on their size. And what you have at the end is a histogram. So on the x-axis you have the bin size limit, and on the y-axis you have the bin population. And that means we have 2 parameters. So here we have 2 tests here, light obscuration and microflow imaging, that basically give comparable answers. They all use the same parameters, and these parameters have to come as a pair, because knowing the equivalent circular diameter, all of them, without the concentration doesn't make sense, and vice versa. So we have here the concept of parameter groups. Yeah, this works also the other way around. So some people in our company like to report the particle size distribution by percentiles. Basically what they are doing is they accumulate the bin populations here and calculate the percentage. And then they go to the y-axis, go to 90 to 50 and to 10%, and read the equivalent circular diameters that belong to these things. And this is something that our data model also can accommodate for. So this is my last slide. I showed you what we call the 3 gears approach, which allowed us to implement business needs and use cases, use case driven and not infrastructure driven. It gave us a modular and flexible and scalable infrastructure. So we work with a federated infrastructure, and the biggest challenge here is, as always, the change process, so making people step away from excellent use structured input. And I talked a bit about the global standards that we introduced, the data contracts and the taxonomy. We think this is a pragmatic transparent and obvious way how things can be organized. It is platform independent, and it can be easily extended across multiple systems. And the challenges here, of course, are you have to work with inconsistent naming conventions. Then governance of the parameters in a rapidly moving deployment is always a problem, avoidance of redundancy. And there are other standards that we have to consider. So for example, regulatory authorities or our own SOPs demand that certain things are called in a certain way that has also to be accounted for here. Yeah. And the last thing is when we bring in additional source systems that are independently of what we did so far, we sometimes have to go into compromises to make things fit together. With this, I would like to thank you and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? This one.
That's a really great approach. What you're doing with the with building the ontologies and doing capturing all the information to make it all reusable and fair data. For the ontologies, where do you stop? Because the data is collected by a person, so you're probably collecting some provenance information. That person is on a site, maybe in a business unit. It's funded by a project. Maybe that project has a customer, and then you've got all the kind of the data owners of who is responsible for naming those terms. So how do you, I guess, keep your ontologies contained to the valuable bits and not let it sprawl to the whole organization?
At the moment, we have just a small team who's responsible for the ontology management. And at the moment, we are thinking of how we get this more into the business. We want to introduce a data steward community, but still a small number of people who understand the importance of this thing, because this ontology is, the taxonomy is really the driver for everything. And so that we really avoid that this runs wild.
Thank you.
I have a related question on that as well, the ontologies, and they're very powerful when used in this context. So you talked about your group that is responsible. Who has the ownership for the decision of what that ontology says, i.e. the truth? Is that your group, or is that?
At the moment, that would be me. That's the final authority. Yeah, the thing is, even among us, we sometimes, even if I do it on different days, I may come up with different terminology. And if we're doing this with 3 or 4 people, then, so we have now basically, the foundation is there. And I want to make sure that, because it was a lot of work to get to the foundation, that this doesn't get spoiled, even by my colleagues. And so that's the reason why we have basically, if we need, we have ad hoc meetings, because sometimes the parameters have to go quickly in there, and then we make a decision and come to the common ground. And if there's no decision possible, then I will make a decision.
Excellent. So yeah, you always need a single point eventually to make a decision on it.
At some point in time, there is no quorum. At some point in time, it has to be yes or no, and
yeah, get the job done. Yeah, good. Any other questions? Another one.
Thanks a lot.
Try again. Try again. There's no button.
Now?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. I would be interested in the synonym management for scientists. I mean, I understand this is probably an implementable way, but how sustainable is this? I assume that people come up with different synonyms. I mean, this needs to be managed. And also you have the potential drawback that people still don't talk the same language, right? Because if then they look into a system, they will expect to find their word, and it's still not then different from how other people enter it. So you have some disadvantages with that as well. So how do you think about that? And you know, what's your, I mean, will you stay with this approach, or?
Yeah. So at the moment, I mean, since we just implemented it, we will definitely run this for a while. Yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of synonyms connected to one term that binds them all. And yeah, I mean, people can look in our systems for their term that they are used to see. And if they want to get a bigger picture of what's going on, they would need to go basically the test also can also be under the hood, so that if they enter a term, that then automatically it translates them back into the parameter and then brings up everything that is there. But it's something we are collecting experiences right now, and I think there's no perfect world. You will always have compromises, but I think see this as a pragmatic approach.
Okay, up one more.
In the same direction.
If you just wait for the speaker. There we go. Oh, the mic.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the same direction. I wonder, it looks great, but how flexible, how agile can you be? Because in the end, you risk to become a bottleneck in the whole management, right?
Where will it become a bottleneck? I didn't understand that.
A bottleneck because you have to make decision on each of the terms,
Yeah.
synonyms at each time before you can use it in the different systems.
Yeah, the good thing is that we are in development sciences and not in discovery. So let's say our world is a bit smaller and not as flexible, because we have processes that need to be followed. And I think this will be there will be sometime an end that will only slow growly from there on. I mean, of course, there will be new analytical tests that come, but overall, I think my wish at the moment is to get under control what we have.
Last question here.
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned, new data to come and new test methods to come. Did you establish a governance for the naming convention of future test methods, that you at least get the variety in future under control and get it narrowed down?
Yeah, that's exactly a work in progress. So at the moment we have basically under control what we have. And we also, I mean, you have to look at this was exactly a problem when we created this first, because when you do the 50th test, you forgot what the second test was called, and you could then easily use a different term here. And at the moment, I mean, our parameters are clear names, but we eventually want to switch then to real IDs, so that we get rid of that thing, and then we make this really a preferred synonym, and it becomes less of a problem.
Thank you. Good questions, guys. There's many nuances into that. So thank you very much. Great talk. Thank you.